To really get why this war is still raging, you have to look past the daily headlines. Because this isn't just about territory. Not really. It's a collision of two completely different worldviews.
And get this, have you ever considered that a major world power is dedicating half of its entire federal budget to a single conflict? That's right, 50%. This fact alone completely shifts the perspective on the Russia-Ukraine war. It tells you this isn't some side project for the Kremlin, it's everything.
Welcome to Strategic Labs. We're going to break down the three fundamental clashes that explain this deadlock. And hey, if you're into this kind of tactical insight, go ahead and like and subscribe. Okay, so the first and maybe the most critical point of collision is right here. It's a deep, fundamental disagreement over what national security and national sovereignty even mean. Russia and Ukraine aren't just using different words, they are speaking two entirely different geopolitical languages. You see, for Russia, this entire conflict is framed through this old-school concept, the sphere of influence. It's the idea that great powers have a right, maybe even a duty, to control what happens right in their own backyard. Their whole strategic view is built on this foundation. So from Moscow's point of view, a Western-aligned, independent Ukraine isn't just a neighbor making its own choices. No, it's seen as a direct, hostile military platform right on its border. The Russian argument is basically that no great power on Earth would just sit back and passively accept a rival setting up shop in such a critical security zone. But for Ukraine, that logic is completely, totally unacceptable. Their whole position is rooted in a core principle of our modern world, the right of a nation to decide its own future. They don't see Russia's argument as a legitimate security concern. They see it as an old-school imperial demand to basically gut their sovereignty. All right, let's move on to the second major clash. This one is all about how each side sees Ukraine itself. Is it a sovereign nation making its own calls? Or is it just a tool being used by outside powers? And the answer to this one single question, it justifies pretty much every action each side takes. Is Ukraine a manipulated proxy, like Russia claims, or is it the agent of its own destiny, as Ukraine insists? The thing is, these two views absolutely cannot coexist. So Russia's narrative is pretty clear. This isn't really Russia versus Ukraine. In their telling, it's Russia versus the West, just happening to be on Ukrainian soil. This framing allows them to paint the whole thing as a defensive great power struggle. But Ukraine says, hold on, we didn't run to the West to threaten Russia. We ran to the West to escape a long, painful history of being trapped in Russia's orbit. And this is where you see the central, almost tragic paradox of Russia's strategy. I mean, look at this. The stated goal was to get more security on the border. The action taken was a full-scale invasion. But the result, the exact opposite. A deeply hostile Ukraine that's now totally dependent on the West. The action literally created the very threat it was supposed to eliminate. And all of that brings us to the final and maybe the most disruptive point of all, the logic of the endgame. Why on earth does this war keep going, despite the insane costs? Well, it's because both sides have done the math, and both have decided that losing is way more expensive than fighting.
This is where the calculation gets so incredibly grim. For Russia, a defeat in Ukraine means becoming a lesser power, stuck with a hostile border for generations. But for Ukraine, a bad peace, one where they give up sovereignty or territory, is seen as just hitting the pause button before the next invasion. For both of them, compromise feels like a much bigger long-term risk than just continuing the war. When you really define what defeat means to each of them, you see just how impossible the situation is. Their goals are mutually exclusive. Russia's definition of victory requires a fundamental limit on Ukrainian sovereignty, and Ukraine's definition of victory requires the complete and total rejection of that idea. There is just no middle ground there. So, when you pull all these points together, what do you get? You get the fundamental deadlock. This isn't some simple argument over a piece of land. It is a head-on collision between two incompatible ideas of how the world should even work.
I mean, this chart just says it all. Look at how differently they define the most basic concepts. For Russia, the conflict is a geopolitical correction. For Ukraine, it's a war of imperial aggression. The stakes for Russia, great power status. For Ukraine, national survival. They are literally fighting two different wars on the very same territory. And that's really the question we have to leave you with. If a win for one side is, by its very definition, an existential loss for the other, what does peace even look like? It completely challenges our concept of a resolution and moves the conflict beyond simple negotiation into a much, much tougher strategic reality. Look,
This is just a preview. For the full deep dive, check out our long-form analysis on the channel. We'll see you in the next one.